Solene Brooks stood in a rain-slicked Seoul alleyway, the blood-stained hem of her service apron peeking out from beneath a $1,000 designer trench coat. She clutched a burner phone to her ear, her breath hitching as she memorized the coordinates for an assassination, his assassination. If she was going to be the collateral in a Mafia blood feud, she'd damn well be the one to decide who survived the night. The man she'd married waited back at the estate in a wheelchair, his chest inked with the geometry of a violent past and eyes colder than a winter morning in Manhattan. Kang Min-jae, the broken boss, the man the world thought was a toothless tiger, and the only person who had looked at a waitress from Queens like she was a queen in her own right. One fake marriage. A palace full of vipers. And a secret recovery that changed everything. What happens when the invisible waitress becomes the only person who can see the truth? And when the man who was supposed to be her captor becomes the only one she's willing to kill for? Buckle up. This syndicate is about to burn. If you're just tuning in, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification button. This is a story of power, betrayal, and a love that wasn't in the contract. Let's dive in. Solene Brooks stood in the center of the Sapphire Room, the most expensive dining area in Midtown, balancing a tray of crystal flutes while her feet throbbed in rhythm with the jazz music. To the billionaires at the table, she was furniture, convenient, silent, and entirely replaceable. She checked her watch. 10 more minutes until she could clock out and check the local hospital for her brother. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a frantic, rhythmic vibration that usually meant bail money or a hospital bill. She ignored it, keeping her posture disciplined and her expression guarded. She was 25, and her life was a series of double shifts and broken promises. She didn't see her brother, Marcus, until she stepped out into the alley behind the restaurant to take out the trash. He wasn't alone. Marcus was slumped against a grease-stained brick wall, his face a map of bruises. Standing over him were 3 men in tailored black suits, their presence as jarring as a funeral at a carnival. One of them held a digital tablet, scrolling through a list of figures that made Solene's stomach turn. "Solene, I tried to make it right," Marcus rasped, his voice wet with blood. The man in the center stepped forward, his eyes traveling over Solene's simple black and white uniform with a clinical, chilling detachment. "Your brother has a very expensive habit, Miss Brooks. He didn't just lose money, he lost our money. 5 million, to be exact." The number was a death sentence. Solene didn't scream, she didn't even flinch. She just felt a cold, familiar weight settle in her chest. "I don't have 5 million, Solene said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline. "I have $80 in my locker and a 2012 Honda." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We don't want your $80, Solene. Our chairman, however, has a very specific problem that requires a very specific distraction. He needs a wife who knows how to be invisible. And you? You've spent your whole life perfecting the art." Solene didn't go back to the restaurant. She didn't even go home. She followed the 3 suits into a sleek black sedan that smelled of expensive leather and cold intentions. They drove in a silence so thick it felt like being underwater, eventually stopping before a nondescript steel door in an alleyway tucked behind a Michelin-starred hotel. Inside, the Obsidian Lounge was a world away from the frantic, grease-scented kitchen Solene had just fled. It was all shadows and velvet, the air heavy with the scent of aged whiskey and something metallic, like the edge of a blade. At the center of the room, positioned beneath a single, dramatic spotlight, sat the man. Kang Min-jae didn't look like a man who had lost the use of his legs. He sat slightly angled, occupying the space with a quiet, terrifying dominance. His black suit jacket hung open, revealing an inked chest where geometric tattoos climbed his neck like a warning. His hair was long and loose, framing a face with cheekbones sharp enough to draw blood. He looked cold, observant, and entirely untouchable. Your brother has a very vivid imagination, Miss Brooks, Min-jae said. His voice was a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. He thought he could gamble with the syndicate's ghost accounts and walk away. He was wrong. Soline stood perfectly still, her hands clasped at her sides in the disciplined stance she'd maintained for years behind a serving tray. She didn't look at the guards, she looked directly into Min-jae's dark, steady eyes. Where is he? Safe. For the next hour, Min-jae replied, his gaze traveling over her modest black and white uniform. He didn't look at her with lust, he looked at her like a strategist evaluating a new piece on a board. $5 million is a debt your family won't clear in 3 lifetimes. But I have a vacancy in my household that is worth exactly that amount. He gestured to the empty space beside his wheelchair. My family is a nest of vipers who think I am broken. They think a man in this chair is easily discarded. I need a wife who can navigate their world without being seen. Someone who knows how to watch from the periphery. Someone the world considers invisible. He leaned forward, the light catching the sharp line of his jaw. You marry me. You move to Seoul. You play the role of the devoted, commoner bride for 1 year. At the end of that year, your brother's debt is erased, and you are given $10 million to start whatever life you want. If you refuse, Marcus becomes a permanent part of the foundation of our new skyscraper in Incheon. Soline felt the air leave her lungs. It wasn't a proposal, it was a ransom. She looked at the tattoos on his neck, then back to his cold, calculating eyes. Why me? She whispered. Because a waitress knows how to keep secrets, Min-jae said, a ghost of a smirk touching his lips. And because you have nothing left to lose. Soline thought of her brother's bruised face and the flickering lights of her studio. She took a breath and stepped into the light. I want it in writing. The contract is already drawn, he said. Welcome to the family, Soline. The descent into Seoul felt less like a landing and more like a fall. Soline watched the neon arteries of the city pulse beneath the wing of the private jet, her reflection in the glass looking like a ghost in a service uniform. She had spent the 14-hour flight staring at a single sheet of paper, the contract that effectively sold her soul to a man she didn't know to save a brother she couldn't give up on. When the car finally pulled through the iron gates of the Kong compound, the scale of her new reality hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't a home, it was a fortress. Set high on a ridge overlooking the Han River, the estate was a sprawling masterwork of glass, black stone, and razor-sharp security. High-definition cameras tracked the car's movement with a predatory whir, and guards in tactical gear stood every 20 paces, their faces as expressionless as the stone walls. The heavy doors of the main house swung open, revealing an interior that was breathtakingly cold. Minimalism had never felt so hostile. Welcome home, Mrs. Kong, a voice draped in silk and glass announced. Soline turned to see a woman standing at the top of the grand staircase. This was Min-jae's mother, Madame Kong. She was dressed in a hanbok of deep charcoal, her silver hair pulled back into a knot so tight it seemed to pull the skin of her face into a permanent mask of disapproval. Beside her stood a younger woman with a smirk that felt like a paper cut, Min-jae's sister, Yuna. She looks exactly like what she is, Yuna whispered, not bothered by whether Soline heard. A girl who spends her life carrying trays and taking orders. Soline felt the heat rise in her neck, but she didn't lower her gaze. She had dealt with demanding New York socialites for years, she knew how to keep her spine straight while being insulted. Min-jae was wheeled into the foyer behind her, the soft hum of his chair the only sound in the cavernous room. The dynamic shifted instantly. The air grew heavy, the guard stiffened, and even Madame Kang's expression flickered with a shadow of something that wasn't quite motherly love. It was calculation. This is Soline, Min-jae said, his voice cutting through the tension. He didn't look at his family. He looked only at the back of Solin's head. She is the mistress of this house now. You will treat her as you treat me. And how is that, Min-jae? Yuna asked, leaning over the railing. With pity? Or with the knowledge that a king in a chair is just a very expensive statue? Solin caught the slight tightening of Min-jae's jaw. In that moment, she realized that 1,000 eyes watching her weren't just security cameras. They were his kin, waiting for a single moment of weakness. She wasn't just a wife, she was a shield for a man who was being hunted in his own hallway. As a maid stepped forward to take her small, battered suitcase, Solin realized with a jolt of terror that the doors behind her hadn't just closed. They had locked. The silence of the Kong estate at night was heavy, vibrating with the low hum of high-tech security and the ghosts of a dozen secrets. Solin lay awake in her sprawling, silk-draped suite, her body refusing to settle into the luxury. To the rest of the world, she was the lottery bride, a commoner who had struck gold. To herself, she was a prisoner waiting for the other shoe to drop. Driven by a restless thirst, she slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cold marble floors. She navigated the dimly lit corridor toward the kitchenette adjoining the master wing, but a sliver of light spilling from the heavy oak doors of Min-jae's private study stopped her cold. She should have kept walking. The contract was clear, no interference, no prying. But the sound coming from inside wasn't the whir of an electric wheelchair or the rustle of papers. It was a rhythmic, heavy thud, the sound of weight meeting floor with agonizing effort. Solin pressed her eye to the gap in the door, and the breath died in her throat. Min-jae wasn't in his chair. He was standing in the center of the room, bathed in the pale, bluish glow of the soul moonlight. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles in his neck stood out in sharp relief, sweat glistening on his inked skin. He was trembling, his hands gripping a set of low parallel bars he must have had installed in secret. He took a step. It was shaky, uncoordinated, and clearly painful, but it was a step. This wasn't the behavior of a man whose spine had been shattered by a bullet. This was a predator rehabilitating in the dark. Solin watched, mesmerized and terrified, as he dragged his left foot forward, his face contorted in a mask of pure, focused rage. He reached the end of the bars and stood tall, his full height dwarfing the wheelchair that sat discarded in the shadows like a stage prop. He wasn't broken. He was hiding. A floorboard groaned under Solin's weight as she instinctively shifted back. In a flash that defied his supposed physical state, Min-jae's head snapped toward the door. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, were now predatory, burning with the heat of a man who had just been caught in his greatest lie. "Do you like what you see, Solin?" he rasped, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly edge. He didn't fall. He stayed standing, his knuckles white as he held himself upright. Solin pushed the door open, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You can walk." "I can survive," he corrected, his gaze pinning her to the spot. "In this house, the only way to see who is holding the knife is to look like you can't fight back. You will tell no one. Not the guards. Not your brother. Not even God." He took a precarious, looming step toward her, the distance between them dissolving. "If this secret leaves this room, Solin, we both die before sunrise." The following morning, the atmosphere in the estate shifted from cold indifference to a calculated, lethal partnership. Min-jae was back in his wheelchair, the mask of the broken boss firmly in place, but the look he gave Solin over his morning tea was sharp with shared conspiracy. He didn't want a wife who sat pretty for the cameras. He wanted the woman who had spent years mastering the art of being invisible in a room full of powerful men. "The board of directors is meeting tonight," Min-jae said, his voice a low vibration that barely carried past their private balcony. "They think I'm incapacitated, a puppet they can maneuver around. My sister and my second-in-command, Han, will be there. They'll speak in metaphors and subtext, assuming I'm too medicated or too weak to care. He looked at Solene, his gaze traveling over her simple, elegant frame. In New York, you were the girl who poured the wine while they discussed million-dollar acquisitions. You know how to read a room without ever making eye contact. Tonight, you aren't the lady of the house. You are the help. Solene understood. She found her old uniform, the crisp black and white service attire she'd brought from Queens, and felt a strange sense of grounding as she buttoned the vest. In the designer gowns Madame Kong had provided, she was a target; in this, she was a ghost. The meeting took place in the soundproofed library. The air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the silent, vibrating tension of a coup in progress. Han, a man with a smile as sharp as a razor, sat at the head of the table, already acting as if the seat belonged to him. Yuna leaned against the mahogany bar, her eyes tracking Min-jae with a pity that felt performative. Solene moved through the shadows of the room with a silent, practiced grace. She refilled crystal glasses and cleared discarded hors d'oeuvres, her head bowed just enough to be dismissed. They ignored her completely. To them, she was merely an extension of the furniture, a waitress bride, who couldn't possibly understand the intricacies of the Kong syndicate's shipping routes or their offshore accounts. The transition needs to be seamless, Han whispered, leaning toward Yuna as Solene reached down to clear his glass. If the board thinks Min-jae is recovering, they won't vote for the restructuring. We need the medical report suppressed. I've handled the doctors, Yuna replied, her voice cold. But we need to move faster. The girl is a wild card. We don't know what she sees. Solene's hand didn't shake as she moved to the next guest. She felt Min-jae's eyes on her from across the room, steady and expectant. She had just heard the confirmation of a betrayal that went deeper than a family feud. They weren't just waiting for him to fail, they were actively ensuring he stayed broken. When the meeting adjourned, Solene waited until the last guard had cleared the wing before entering Min-jae's study. She didn't say a word, she simply handed him a cocktail napkin. On the back, she had scribbled 3 names and a date, the doctors being paid to falsify his paralysis. Min-jae looked at the napkin, then up at her, a dark spark of admiration lighting his eyes. They didn't even notice you were listening. They never do, Solene whispered, the weight of the danger finally settling in. But Min-jae, they aren't just waiting for you to stay in that chair. They're planning to make sure you never leave it alive. The tension in the study was no longer just about survival, it was a physical weight, pulling them toward each other in the suffocating silence of the estate. Min-jae sat by the floor-to-ceiling window, the moonlight carving his silhouette into sharp, jagged lines. He had shed his suit jacket, his dress shirt unbuttoned to the waist as he cleaned the grime of his secret physical therapy from his skin. Solene approached him to set down a tray of water, but her eyes lingered on the intricate ink that spilled across his collarbone and down his chest. Up close, the geometric patterns weren't just designs, they were names and dates, woven into a tapestry of mourning. You're staring, Min-jae said. He didn't look at her, but his voice held a raw edge she hadn't heard before. The tattoos, Solene whispered, her heart skipping a beat. They aren't for intimidation, are they? Min-jae finally looked up, his eyes weary. They are a cemetery, Solene. Every line is a life the syndicate cost me. My father. My brothers. The friends who took bullets meant for a man who can't even stand to face his enemies. He touched a dark, shaded square over his heart. This one is for the man I was before the hit. The one who thought he could lead with honor. The distance between them felt like a chasm that Solene was suddenly tired of crossing alone. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she traced the edge of the ink on his shoulder. His skin was hot, his pulse thrumming beneath her touch like a trapped bird. You aren't a cemetery, Min-jae, she said softly. You're a fortress. And even fortresses need someone to hold the gate. Min Jae reached up, his hand catching hers. He didn't pull her away, he pressed her palm flat against his chest, right over the ink, right over his racing heart. The air in the room seemed to vanish. In his gaze, the cold calculating boss was gone, replaced by a man who was starving for something more than power. He pulled her down toward him, his strength surprising her as he guided her onto his lap. The wheelchair, the symbol of his feigned weakness, was forgotten as his lips met hers. It was a desperate, hungry collision, a breaking of the dam that had held back weeks of forced proximity and unspoken desire. Soline felt his hands tangle in her hair, pulling her closer as if he could merge his dark world with her light. In the shadows of the study, surrounded by the ghosts of his past and the vipers of his present, they found a frantic, forbidden sanctuary. For the first time since landing in Seoul, Soline wasn't a waitress or a pawn, and Min Jae wasn't a crippled king. They were just two people clinging to each other while the world outside prepared to burn. The morning after the study felt like a fragile glass sculpture, beautiful but destined to shatter. Soline moved through the estate with a new warmth in her chest, a secret confidence that didn't go unnoticed by the predator circling the hallways. Han, Min Jae's second-in-command, stood by the balcony overlooking the Han River, his eyes narrowing as he watched Soline navigate the breakfast service with an effortless grace that no longer felt like a performance. Han wasn't a fool. He had noticed the way the waitress bride lingered near the vents during sensitive calls, and the way Min Jae's eyes followed her, not with the glazed look of a medicated patient, but with the sharp focus of a man who had found his North Star. To Han, Soline was no longer a silent fixture, she was a leak in his sinking ship. By noon, the alarm bells of the Kong Syndicate's digital infrastructure began to scream. Soline was in the kitchen, preparing a specific herbal tea for Min Jae's recovery, when the heavy oak doors were thrown open. A dozen security guards swarmed the room, followed by Han, who carried a tablet like a weapon. Behind him, Yuna wore an expression of triumphant disgust. "I warned you, Min Jae," Han's voice boomed, echoing through the foyer as he gestured toward the screen. "You brought a street-level opportunist into the heart of our operations, and she did exactly what we expected." Min Jae was wheeled into the center of the chaos, his face a mask of Arctic stone. "Explain yourself, Han." "A massive data breach," Han sneered, thrusting the tablet toward Min Jae. "Our offshore account coordinates, the shipping manifests for the Incheon port, and the private medical files of the entire board, all uploaded to an encrypted server in New York 2 hours ago. The IP address? It traces directly back to the laptop in the mistress's suite." Soline's heart plummeted. "That's impossible. I haven't touched that computer since I arrived." "Save the performance for the magistrate," Yuna snapped, stepping forward to slap a burner phone onto the marble counter. "We found this hidden in your laundry. It contains outbound logs to an American journalist. You didn't just marry for the money, Soline. You're a corporate spy." Soline looked at Min Jae, desperate for the man from the night before to emerge. But his face remained a terrifying void. He looked at the evidence, then at the girl who had just touched the ink on his skin, his gaze turning cold enough to freeze the blood in her veins. "The breach is verified," Han pressed, his smile a thin, lethal line. "In our world, the penalty for this level of betrayal is buried in the same foundation as her brother." Soline realized then that the trap hadn't just been set, it had been sprung with clinical precision. Han hadn't just framed her for a crime, he had used her connection to Min Jae to cut off her only source of protection. She was no longer the invisible waitress, she was the enemy. The betrayal in Min Jae's eyes was so absolute it felt like a physical blow to Soline's chest. He didn't defend her. He didn't even look at her as Han's men grabbed her arms, their grip bruising her skin. Instead, Min Jae turned his wheelchair away, his voice like cracking ice. "Get her out of my sight," he rasped. "She is nothing to me but a debt that has been defaulted on." Handle her as you see fit, Han. Soline felt the world tilt. The man who had held her with such desperation hours before was gone, replaced by the Arctic monster the world feared. As she was dragged toward the lower holding cells, she didn't see the way Min-jae's knuckles turned white against his armrests, or the way he signaled his most loyal silent guard with a flicker of his gaze. The escape was a blur of shadows and violence. In the middle of the night, her cell door didn't just open, it was unlocked by a guard who handed her a passport and a thick envelope of cash without saying a word. "Go," he whispered. "The back gate is looped on the security feed for exactly 90 seconds. She ran. She ran through the rain-slicked gardens of the estate, her breath hitching in her throat, until she reached a black sedan idling by the perimeter. She realized then that Min-jae's rejection had been a death-defying theater, a public casting out to ensure Han wouldn't kill her on the spot. He had saved her life by breaking her heart. The flight back to New York was a fever dream of turbulence and silent tears. Soline sat in the back of the plane, clutching her stomach, the weight of the Kong Syndicate's world still pressing down on her shoulders. She was back where she started, yet fundamentally altered. A week after landing in Queens, the morning air in her small apartment felt stifling. The scent of the coffee from the shop downstairs, which usually brought her comfort, now made her stomach roll with a violent intensity. She sat on the edge of her bathtub, staring at the plastic stick in her hand until the two pink lines blurred into one. She was pregnant. She was carrying the heir to a trillion-dollar criminal empire, a child of a man who was faking a paralysis to survive a war she had barely escaped. Soline leaned her head against the cool tile, a hand instinctively dropping to her womb. She had come home to save her brother and find her peace, but she had brought the most dangerous secret of all back with her. She was no longer just a waitress or a pawn, she was the keeper of the Kong bloodline, and she knew with a chilling certainty that the vipers in Seoul wouldn't stay on their side of the ocean for long. 6 months later, the chime above the door of the Gilded Griddle was the only music Soline needed. Located in a quiet corner of Queens, the diner was a sharp contrast to the cold marble of Seoul. Here, the air smelled of maple syrup, burnt coffee, and the honest sweat of people who worked for their keep. Soline moved behind the counter with a fluid grace, her pregnancy now a heavy, beautiful curve beneath her apron that she no longer had to hide. She was no longer just a waitress taking orders, she was the owner, the strategist, and a ghost in the machine of global finance. Every night, after the last customer left and the "closed" sign was flipped, Soline didn't go to sleep. She sat in the back booth with a laptop, the blue light reflecting in her tired eyes as she moved through the dark web and offshore trading platforms. The settlement money Min-jae had sent her away with was a fortune, but she hadn't spent it on luxury. She had spent it on leverage. Using the shell companies she had learned about while eavesdropping in the Kong library, Soline had been quietly and systematically buying up devalued Kong Syndicate stocks. Every time Han made a move that destabilized the company, the price dropped, and Soline bought more. She was building a digital fortress. She wasn't just saving for a college fund, she was acquiring the very ground Min-jae's enemies stood on. One evening, as she scrubbed the counter, a news report flashed on the small television bolted above the bar. It was a grainy shot of the Kong headquarters in Seoul. The headline read, "Syndicate power struggle deepens as chairman's health declines." There was a brief image of Han stepping out of a black sedan, looking triumphant, followed by a shot of the empty wheelchair being loaded into a van. Soline gripped the damp cloth until her knuckles turned white. She felt a sharp kick from within, a reminder of the bloodline she carried. To the world, Min-jae was a fading memory, a broken leader pushed aside by a hungry lieutenant. But Soline looked at her laptop, where her dashboard showed she now controlled a nearly 5% stake in the syndicate's shipping arm. She was no longer the girl pouring the tea, she was the one who could pull the rug out from under the entire boardroom. She was the queen of queens, waiting for the right moment to strike back. She had the money, she had the data, and she had the air. All she needed now was the man who had sent her away to save her. And as she looked at the rain blurring the New York streets, she had a feeling he was already on his way. The bell above the door chimed at precisely 11 p.m., just as Soline was wiping down the far end of the counter. She didn't look up immediately. "We're closed, honey," she said, her voice weary but kind. "But if you're just looking for a coffee to go, I can." The air in the diner suddenly changed. It grew heavy, charged with a familiar, electric tension that made the hair on her arms stand up. Soline froze, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She slowly lifted her gaze, and the damp cloth slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Standing by the door was a man who looked like a ghost returned to life. He wasn't in a wheelchair. He wasn't surrounded by a phalanx of guards in tactical gear. Kang Min-jae stood tall, his broad shoulders filling the entryway, dressed in a simple black overcoat that did little to hide the powerful, steady stance of a man who had reclaimed his strength. He held a sleek, carbon fiber cane in his right hand, but he wasn't leaning on it for support, he held it like a scepter he no longer needed. "Soline," he breathed. The sound of her name in his low, resonant voice broke the silence of the Queen's night. Soline stepped out from behind the counter, her hands instinctively cradling the prominent curve of her stomach. She saw his eyes drop to her waist, and for a fleeting second, the Arctic mask of the Mafia boss shattered. His expression crumbled into something raw, vulnerable, and profoundly human. "The war is over," he said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. Each footfall was a testament to the agony he had endured to reach her. "Han is in custody. Yuna has been exiled. The board knows exactly whose blood runs through the Kong syndicate now." He stopped a few feet from her, the light of the diner reflecting in the dark depths of his eyes. "I had to let you go so I could burn it all down without you catching a spark. I hated every second of the silence. I hated the lie." Soline looked at him, really looked at him. The tattoos on his neck were still there, but the predatory edge in his gaze had been replaced by a quiet, steady devotion. "You walked here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I walked for you," he replied. He reached out, his hand shaking slightly as he touched the curve of her belly, feeling the life kicking beneath the surface. "And for them. I'm done being a king in a cage, Soline. I'm ready to be the man you deserve. No contracts. No secrets. Just us." In the quiet of the Queen's diner, the distance between Seoul and New York finally vanished. Soline leaned into his touch, realizing that while she had become a queen in his absence, she finally had a partner who was strong enough to stand by her side. The final stand wasn't a battle of bullets, it was the simple, monumental act of coming home. From a waitress in Queens to the secret heart of a global empire, Soline and Min-jae's story proves that the person the world overlooks is often the one who changes everything. But their journey is just beginning. If you want to see more stories of unexpected power and forbidden love, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss a chapter. What was your favorite moment, the secret training in the moonlight or the diner reunion? Let us know in the comments below.